What if falling in love was considered a breach of contract, a mistake so costly it could destroy everything you care about? What if telling the truth about your feelings meant losing safety, security, and the one person who finally sees you? This is not a love story about fate or fairy tales. It's about fear, control, and the moment two people realize that obeying the rules may cost them their hearts. I want to ask you something uncomfortable before we begin. What happens when two people are so afraid of being hurt that they decide emotions themselves are the enemy? Because this story doesn't begin with love. It begins with fear. Fear of poverty, fear of humiliation, fear of losing control, and one decision made in desperation that quietly set everything on fire. She was standing alone in a ballroom that glittered like a different universe. Crystal chandeliers, silk gowns, laughter that sounded polished, rehearsed. And then there was her, a woman named Clara Whitfield, clutching a worn handbag like armor, wearing a dress that tried its best, but still whispered to everyone in the room that she did not belong. She wasn't poor in spirit. She wasn't uneducated. She wasn't invisible. But in that room, surrounded by generational wealth and effortless privilege, she was treated like an error, like someone who had wandered in by mistake. I've always believed that humiliation is one of the most violent emotions humans experience, not because it hurts loudly, but because it happens quietly, in public, while everyone else pretends not to see it. Someone did see it. Across the room stood Julian Cross, a celebrated neurosurgeon, a self-made millionaire, the kind of man magazines describe as untouchable. Yet if you had been close enough, you would have noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders stayed rigid under his tailored suit. He was being cornered by expectations, by a mother who believed love should be strategic, by a future already planned for him without his consent. Two people, two different cages, and then the moment happened. A man, drunk on entitlement, looked at Clara and assumed she was staff, asked her to fetch a drink, loud enough for others to hear, soft enough to pretend it wasn't cruelty. That was the second everything changed. Because Julian moved. He didn't hesitate. He didn't calculate. He didn't protect his reputation. He stepped into her space and whispered something that should never have worked. Pretend to be my wife. Think about that. Not are you okay? Not let me help you. But a lie, a dangerous one. A lie that required trust between two strangers who had nothing to lose and everything to risk. She agreed, and for the rest of the night, the world believed them. I want you to notice something important here. This was not romance. This was survival. Two people using performance to escape pressure. Two people discovering far too late that pretending can be intoxicating. Welcome back to Untold Journey Stories. If you've ever been fascinated by stories where human emotions collide with impossible rules, you're exactly where you belong. What makes this story different isn't the wealth, or the glamour, or even the shocking lie whispered in a ballroom. It's what came after. Because a week later, when the lights dimmed and real life returned, Julian didn't disappear. He walked into Clara's world, a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and exhaustion, a life balanced on unpaid medical bills and quiet panic. And instead of apologizing for the lie, he made it permanent. He offered her a contract, a 1-year marriage in name only, public appearances, smiles on demand. In exchange, her mother's life would be saved, every debt erased, every fear neutralized. On paper it was flawless, clean, logical, safe, until you read the clause. If either of them developed genuine romantic feelings, the agreement would end immediately. No exceptions, no grace period, no mercy. Love was not just discouraged, it was punished. And this is where I want you to pause with me, because this isn't just a story about two people. It's about a belief many of us secretly carry. That love is dangerous, that vulnerability is a liability, that if we can just write enough rules, we can finally feel safe. Julian believed he was protecting himself. Clara believed she was sacrificing herself. Neither of them understood the real cost yet. If this opening already has your heart racing, if you feel that quiet pull of curiosity asking how a contract like this could ever end well, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps Untold Journey Stories alive and allows us to keep bringing you stories that don't just entertain, but make you feel something real. Because from this moment on, nothing in their lives will remain pretend. That single lie in the ballroom did not fade with the music. It followed her home, lingered in the quiet spaces of her real life, and waited for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. A week after the wedding, Clara Whitfield was back where reality had sharp edges. The kind of place where the air smelled like burnt coffee and old regret, where exhaustion clung to everything like a second skin. She moved between tables on autopilot, her smile polite, her thoughts elsewhere. The memory of crystal lights and borrowed confidence felt unreal now, like something she had dreamed during a short, reckless sleep. Then the door opened. I want you to understand how unsettling this moment was. Not romantic, not cinematic, just deeply destabilizing. Julian Cross stood in the doorway of the diner as if he didn't belong to gravity the same way everyone else did. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. It was the same silence that had rippled through the ballroom, but here in this small, ordinary place it felt almost intrusive, like wealth and power had crossed an invisible boundary and broken an unspoken rule. He didn't smile. He didn't pretend this was a coincidence. His eyes found her immediately. When he spoke her name, it sounded deliberate, controlled, final. They sat across from each other in a cracked vinyl booth, and for the first time since that night, there was no audience, no performance, just two people staring at the consequences of a choice neither of them had fully considered. Julian didn't ask how she was. He didn't apologize. He laid out facts. Her mother's condition, the unpaid hospital bills, the math that never worked, no matter how many hours she gave away. He spoke the way surgeons speak before an operation, calmly, precisely, without ornament. It was unnerving how well he understood the fragility of her life. Then he made the offer. A formal arrangement, 1 year. A marriage that existed only in public. Dinners, galas, boardroom appearances. Smiles that needed to look real enough to survive scrutiny. In return, every debt would disappear. Her mother would receive care without compromise. No corners cut. No waiting lists. No fear. If you're listening to this and thinking it sounds like salvation, you're not wrong. It was. But salvation that arrives this cleanly is rarely free. Julian slid a tablet across the table. Clara scrolled through pages of legal language she barely understood until her eyes caught on a single heading that made her chest tighten. An emotional attachment termination clause. If either of them developed genuine romantic feelings, the contract would end immediately. All support would stop. No discussion. No negotiation. This is where the story stops being about wealth and starts being about control. Julian explained it like a safeguard, a necessary boundary, a way to ensure clarity. He didn't say the word fear, but it hung between them like smoke. His last marriage had taught him something brutal. That love, once invited in, refused to follow rules. That emotion disrupted judgment. That vulnerability came with a cost he was no longer willing to pay. So he did what people like him always do. He built a system. Something measurable, something enforceable, something that turned feelings into violations. I remember thinking as I first heard this story, how familiar that instinct is. How many of us try to negotiate with our hearts instead of listening to them. How often we tell ourselves that if we just stay detached, just stay careful, we'll finally be safe. Clara understood the trap immediately. If she fell in love and told the truth, she would lose everything that mattered. If she fell in love and stayed silent, she would become someone she didn't recognize. Honesty, in this arrangement, wasn't rewarded, it was punished. And yet she signed. Not because she was naive, not because she believed she could outsmart emotion, but because desperation doesn't leave room for philosophy. When someone you love is sick and the clock is always ticking, ideals become luxuries you cannot afford. Julian believed the clause protected him. Clara believed the contract protected her family. Both of them believed control could replace trust. What neither of them realized, sitting in that diner with its chipped mugs and tired linoleum floors, was that they had just created the most dangerous kind of agreement. One that demanded they lie not just to the world, but eventually to themselves. Because the moment you make love illegal, you don't eliminate it. You only teach it to hide. And hidden things have a way of growing teeth. The problem with a rule designed to suppress emotion is that it doesn't erase feeling. It only forces it to change shape. Once Clara moved into Julian's penthouse, the arrangement began to look flawless from the outside. Separate wings, separate schedules, clear expectations. Everything was engineered to keep their lives orderly and emotionally distant. The space itself seemed to enforce discipline, all glass and steel and echoing quiet, as if warmth had been intentionally designed out of it. At first, the structure worked. They learned how to perform with remarkable efficiency. Public appearances became rehearsed routines. His hand would rest lightly at her back, just long enough for cameras to catch it. Her smile would soften at precisely the right moments. They spoke in practiced tones, never too intimate, never too cold. From a distance, they looked convincing. From up close, they looked careful. And careful is exhausting. What no one tells you about pretending is how much effort it takes to remain hollow. Every laugh has to be measured. Every glance has to be filtered. Every instinct to reach for comfort has to be intercepted and redirected. Clara felt it most in the quiet moments, late at night, when the penthouse settled into silence and the act was no longer required. She would lie awake, listening to the faint hum of the city below, wondering when performance had started to feel heavier than truth. Julian noticed it too, though he would never admit it aloud. He had built his life on control, on precision, on eliminating variables before they could become threats. Yet something about sharing space with Clara introduced an unfamiliar static into his carefully ordered world. Her presence was subtle but persistent, like a question he could not stop hearing. The first real fracture came unexpectedly. Clara fell ill. Not dramatically, no grand collapse. Just a quiet, stubborn fever that crept in as she pushed herself through obligation after obligation, determined not to be the weak link in an already precarious agreement. She insisted she was fine. Julian knew better. He always did. What happened next was not part of any contract. He canceled surgeries. He cleared his schedule without explanation. He brought her soup himself, sat beside her bed longer than necessary, checked her temperature with the focused concern of a man who had forgotten he was supposed to remain distant. His voice stayed clinical, his instructions precise, but his actions betrayed him. When his hand lingered at her temple for a second too long, both of them felt it. That was the moment he pulled away. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared enough to be afraid. He retreated into formality, into silence, into the safety of his rules. Clara understood the message without a word being spoken. This had crossed a line neither of them was ready to acknowledge. Soon after, they traveled together for one of Julian's professional commitments, an old city. Narrow streets worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, stone bridges arching over slow-moving water, the kind of place that invites honesty simply by existing. They walked side by side through crowds of strangers who assumed intimacy without question, their arms brushing, their steps unconsciously falling into rhythm. There were no cameras in those moments, no obligation to perform. And that made it dangerous. They talked about nothing that mattered and everything that did. He told her about the early years of his career, about how ambition had slowly replaced joy without him noticing. She spoke about the dreams she had quietly set aside, the life she might have lived if fear hadn't been such a constant companion. Their laughter came easily, too easily. On a bridge overlooking the river, music drifted up from somewhere unseen, a violin, soft and unhurried. They stopped walking. Neither of them spoke. The space between them narrowed, not because they moved closer, but because the distance no longer felt necessary. Julian turned toward her. Clara looked up. For a breathless moment, the world simplified. No clauses, no contracts, no carefully negotiated boundaries. Just two people standing at the edge of something irreversible. They stopped themselves at the same instant. Panic flickered across their faces, mirrored and undeniable. They stepped back, creating space as if distance alone could restore control. They walked away from the bridge in silence, each one carrying the same unspoken realization. Pretending was no longer harmless. From that point on, the tension shifted. It sharpened. Every shared look felt loaded. Every accidental touch carried consequences. They became experts at avoidance, at maintaining a brittle professionalism that fooled no one who mattered. The rule that was supposed to protect them now hovered over every interaction, not as a safeguard, but as a threat. What struck me most when I first heard this part of their story was how familiar it felt. How often people mistake restraint for strength. How often they confuse emotional denial with discipline. Julian believed he was maintaining order. Clara believed she was surviving. In reality, both of them were already in trouble, because once pretend starts to feel real, the lie isn't the performance anymore. The lie is believing you can walk away untouched. Once that line between performance and truth blurred, it was only a matter of time before something outside their control came crashing in and forced everything into the open. The catalyst did not arrive quietly. It arrived as a headline. Clara saw it first, late one evening, scrolling without intention, her thumb slowing as a familiar name caught her eye. Julian Cross, a memoir excerpt released by his former wife. The language was sharp, dramatic, designed to wound. He was described as cold, unfeeling, incapable of love. A man who saved lives in operating rooms and destroyed them in private. The internet devoured it instantly. Comments multiplied. Judgments hardened. A narrative was forming, and it was not kind. What struck Clara wasn't shock, it was anger. Not the distant irritation of someone defending a reputation, but the visceral rage of someone who knew the truth and watched it being twisted beyond recognition. The man being described was not the one who sat by her bed during a fever, counting minutes between doses, not the one who listened quietly as she spoke about dreams she barely admitted to herself, not the one who had looked at her on that bridge as if he were standing at the edge of something terrifying and beautiful. She found him alone that night. Julian stood near the window of his study, the city lights reflected faintly in the glass, a drink untouched in his hand. His posture was rigid, defensive, as if bracing for impact that had already landed. He didn't turn when she entered. He didn't need to. He knew why she was there. She told him the article was a lie. At first, he dismissed it with bitter logic. Public perception, media cycles, none of it mattered. But his voice betrayed him. There was something frayed beneath the composure, something exhausted. Years of emotional restraint had not made him immune to pain. They had only delayed it. Clara did something that surprised both of them. She stepped closer and took the glass from his hand. Not forcefully, not dramatically, just enough to break the moment he was hiding behind. She told him he wasn't what they said he was. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't polished. It was raw and direct, fueled by loyalty he had never asked for and never expected. She spoke about the man she knew, not the one being sold to strangers. Her voice didn't shake. Her certainty did not waver. That was the moment something inside him gave way. Julian turned toward her, and the control he had spent a lifetime perfecting cracked under the weight of being truly seen. The distance he had maintained for months collapsed in a single step. He pulled her into him, not gently, not carefully, but desperately, as if the act itself were a lifeline. The kiss was not romantic in the way people like to imagine. It was urgent, uncontrolled, a release of everything he had denied himself. It carried fear and hunger and relief all at once. Clara responded without hesitation, her hands gripping his jacket, her body leaning into the truth neither of them could afford to ignore anymore. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and stunned, the silence was unbearable. Reality rushed back in with brutal clarity. They had crossed the one line that was never supposed to be crossed. Julian stepped away first. The transformation was immediate and devastating. The man who had kissed her moments ago retreated behind the familiar armor of logic and protocol. His voice flattened, his expression closed. He began speaking not as a partner or even as a man, but as an authority issuing a diagnosis. According to the contract, the agreement was terminated. He moved to his desk and began preparing the paperwork, his movements precise, mechanical, as if following procedure could erase what had just happened. Watching him was like watching someone amputate a part of themselves to preserve an idea of order that no longer made sense. Clara felt the fracture inside her turn into something else entirely. She stopped him, not with pleading, not with tears, but with truth. She told him she had broken the clause weeks ago, long before the kiss, long before the bridge. She told him she had fallen in love quietly, dangerously, without permission, and that she had carried it alone because she believed honesty would cost her everything. The room seemed to tilt under the weight of her confession. Julian froze. The system he had built could handle violations from one side. It could not handle mutual guilt. The clause that was designed to protect him now trapped him. If both parties were in breach, who enforced the penalty? Who held the authority to punish the other? Logic had nowhere left to go. What I find most striking about this moment is not the kiss itself, but what followed. The realization that rules created to prevent pain often create something far worse. That control, when taken too far, becomes a form of self-harm. They stood there, suspended in the wreckage of their own design. The contract was broken, but not resolved. The truth had been spoken, but not yet accepted. And for the first time since the night they met, there was no script left to follow. The system had failed, and what remained was the most dangerous thing of all: choice. Once the system collapsed and choice became unavoidable, the only question left was who would be brave enough to make the first move. Clara was the one who left, not because she stopped loving Julian, and not because she wanted to punish him for choosing logic over vulnerability. She left because staying meant existing in a limbo where truth had been spoken but not acted upon. The contract was gone, but its shadow still filled the penthouse. Every room felt like a reminder of rules that no longer applied and feelings that had no place to land. She told him she needed space, not as an ultimatum, but as an act of self-preservation. For once, she was choosing herself without negotiation. Julian did not try to stop her. He had no right. He had built his life on structure, and that structure had failed the moment it was tested by honesty. Watching her walk away was the first time he understood what real loss felt like. The penthouse, once his sanctuary of order, became unbearably silent. The walls that had protected him from chaos now trapped him inside it. He moved through his days on autopilot, returning home to rooms that felt hollow without her quiet presence. He replayed every moment he had chosen restraint over courage, every time he had mistaken control for strength. It took him longer than it should have to admit the truth, that the contract had never protected him. It had only delayed the inevitable. Love had not ruined his life. Fear had. When he finally went looking for her, he did not bring conditions. He did not bring explanations. He brought freedom. They met again in the most ordinary place imaginable, a small cafe, neutral ground, no witnesses to impress, no past performances to uphold. Clara looked different there, calmer, stronger, like someone who had stopped waiting for permission to exist fully. Julian did not sit immediately. He stood across from her, visibly uncertain, holding something that did not look like leverage or power. It was a plane ticket, open-ended, anywhere in the world. He told her the truth, that the financial support for her mother was permanent, that she owed him nothing, that she could leave and build a life untouched by his mistakes, and that if she chose to walk away, he would not follow. It was the first time he had offered anything without a clause attached. This is the moment people often misunderstand, because they expect grand speeches or dramatic declarations. What Julian offered instead was restraint, the kind that comes not from fear but from respect. He gave her the one thing she had never been allowed in the beginning, a real choice. And then he left. Clara sat there long after he was gone, staring at the ticket as if it were a mirror. It represented escape, reinvention, safety, everything she had once believed she needed. But as she imagined a future without him in it, the world felt strangely empty. Not quiet in a peaceful way, quiet in the way that follows something unfinished. She realized then that love, when it is real, does not feel like a trap. It feels like clarity. She went back, not because she was rescued, not because she was dependent, but because she chose him freely, knowing exactly who he was and what it would cost to love him. When Julian saw her again, standing in the doorway of the penthouse with steady eyes and unguarded resolve, something in him finally loosened. The relief was not loud. It was profound, like a man realizing he no longer had to hold his breath. Their life after that was not dramatic. It was honest. They learned each other slowly, without scripts or expectations. Arguments were no longer violations. Silence was no longer a threat. Love without rules turned out to be less dangerous than fear ever was. A year later, Julian brought her back to the place where it all began. Not the ballroom, but a quiet rooftop overlooking the city, lit softly, intentionally modest. When he knelt, there was no performance, no audience, just a man offering his future without guarantees. He did not promise perfection. He promised presence. Clara said yes without hesitation. Their marriage did not erase the past. It reframed it. The contract that once governed their lives became a lesson instead of a wound, A reminder that systems built to avoid pain often create it, and that love cannot be regulated without losing its meaning. If there is one thing this story leaves me with, it is this. The greatest risk is not loving too deeply. The greatest risk is designing a life so carefully that there is no room left to feel alive. They did not win by following the rules. They won by choosing each other when the rules fell apart. When I step back and look at this story as a whole, what stays with me isn't the wealth, the contracts, or even the romance. It's the quiet warning hidden beneath all of it. The danger was never love. The danger was the belief that love could be controlled, postponed, or eliminated without consequence. Julian believed that rules could protect him from pain. Clara believed that endurance and sacrifice were the price of survival. Both of them were acting in ways many of us recognize. We build emotional walls after being hurt. We negotiate with our feelings instead of listening to them. We convince ourselves that if we stay logical, careful, and detached, we'll finally be safe. But safety without connection slowly becomes another kind of loneliness. The contract in this story wasn't just a legal document. It was a mirror. It reflected how fear disguises itself as discipline, how control pretends to be wisdom, and how avoiding vulnerability often costs us far more than taking the risk ever could. The moment Julian offered Clara freedom with no conditions, the entire dynamic changed. Love stopped being a transaction and became a choice. And only then did it become real. The deeper lesson here is not about grand romantic gestures. It's about courage. The courage to admit when a rule no longer serves us. The courage to choose honesty, even when it threatens the structures we've built to feel secure. And the courage to accept that pain is not proof of failure, but evidence that we are alive and connected. So how do we apply this to our own lives? Start by noticing where you've created invisible contracts. The rules you've set for yourself about who you're allowed to care about, how much you're willing to feel, or how safe love must be before you let it in. Ask yourself whether those rules are protecting you or quietly isolating you. Growth often begins not when we add more structure, but when we loosen it just enough to let something real in. Before we end, I'd love to hear from you. Do you believe it's better to protect your heart at all costs, or to risk being hurt for the chance of something real? Please share your thoughts in the comments so we can all learn from each other's perspectives. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to Untold Journey Stories. Your support helps us continue creating stories that explore not just love, but the choices that shape who we become.